You write that one of the most famous statements of Confucianism is the belief that, quote, people are pretty much alike at birth, but become differentiated via learning. So this sets the tradition that China places a high value on education and on meritocracy. Can you speak to this Confucius's idea of education, and how much does it permeate to the China of today?
Sure. So there's an optimism to this. There's an optimism in the sense of a ability that people can be good. And when exposed to exemplary figures from the past, they'll want to be like those exemplary figures. So it's a form of education through kind of emulation of models and study of past figures and past texts that were exemplary. And it did have this idea, a relatively positive view of human nature and the sort of changeability of humans through education. And I think that shows through in all kinds of things, even the fact that while there were lots of killings by the Chinese Communist Party and other groups, there was often an idea that that people could be remolded potentially. And China was one of the few places where they didn't kill the last emperor. The last emperor, the idea was that he could anybody could be kind of turned into a citizen of this or a subject of this, a good member of this polity through the kind of education. Often it was a very kind of forceful form of education, but I think that's a carryover from the Confucian times. And over time, this Confucian idea led to the creation of one of the early great civil service exams, an idea that bureaucracy should be run not by people who were born into the right families, but ones who had shown their ability to master these really intensive kind of exams. And the exams were things that could make or break your career, a bit like at some points in the American past, passing a bar exam, a really intensive thing, could set you on the road to a good career. In China, you had the civil service exam tradition. So I think this kind of emphasis on education and on valuing of scholarly pursuits, but then Chinese leaders throughout history, including up to Mao and Xi Jinping, have also found scholars to be tremendously difficult to control. So there's an ambivalence to it, or contradiction again there.
But to which degree this idea of meritocracy that's inherent to the notion that we all start at the same line, there's a meritocratic view of human nature there, where if you work hard and you learn things, you will succeed. And so the reverse, if you haven't succeeded, that means you didn't work hard and therefore do not deserve the spoils of the success. Does that carry over to the China of today?
There's such a challenge in all these forms of meritocracy because you had the civil service exams, but the question was who if you had a really good tutor, if you could afford a really good tutor, you had a better chance of passing the exams. One thing that happened there was families would pool together resources to try to help the brightest in their group to be able to become part of the officialdom. And this kind of pooling together resources to help as a family was an important part of that structure. But there also was a kind of there was always a tension of that. So what if you don't succeed? Some of the leaders of rebellions against emperors were failed examination candidates, and
Yeah,
this
yeah.
you had this issue, and then it became something. Well, the system was out of whack, and it needed a new leader, and also there was something built in that was not so much Confucius himself, but one of his main interpreters, early interpreters, Mencius, had this idea, which can be seen as a crude justification for rebellion or for a kind of democracy, to say that even though the emperor rules at the will of heaven, if if he doesn't act like a true emperor, if he's not morally upstanding, then heaven will remove its mandate to him, and then there's no obligation to show deference for a ruler who's not behaving like a true ruler, and there it sort of justifies rebellion. And the idea is that if the rebellion isn't justified, then heaven will stop the ruler from being killed. But if heaven has removed his support, then the rebellion will succeed, and then a new ruler will be justified in taking power. So it's an interesting sense that the universe in this Confucian view has a kind of moral
Mhm.
dimension to it, but it also it's when things actually happen that you see where the side of morality is.
Okay. So it's meritocracy with an asterisk. It does seem to be the case, maybe you can speak to that, that in the Chinese education system, there seems to be a high value for excellence. Hopefully, I'm not generalizing too much, but from the things I've seen, there are certain cultures, certain peoples that, it's just part of the value system of the culture that you need to be a really good student. Is that the case with the China of today?
There's been a lot of emphasis on education and sort of working really hard and excelling at some subjects and having there isn't the civil service exam, but there is the Gaokao, an exam that really can determine where you get what kind of institution you get into. And I think, getting back to this idea of meritocracy, which is strong in a lot of tradition, it also a kind of what it opens you up to is when there is a sense of unfairness in who's getting ahead and how the spoils are being divided. This leads to a kind of outrage. And some of the biggest protests in China have been about this sense of nepotism, which really seems to subvert this whole um, idea of kind of meritocracy. And the 1989 protests at Tiananmen, even though kind of in the Western press in particular, it was discussed as a movement for democracy. But a lot of the first posters that went up that got students really angry were criticisms of corruption within the Communist Party and nepotism, and this sense that people, despite all the talk, I mean, despite the fact that most people seem to be having to study really hard to pass these exams to get good positions in universities, that some of them were being handed out via the kind of back door, and that led to a kind of outrage. Not, I mean, that's true in many places, but I think it gives a special anger against nepotism because of that. The way in which so much emphasis is put on kind of the standard exam way of getting ahead.